Hey, welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, head right here and submit your question for a future episode. Got some good questions? Let's talk about it. Am I being too hard on my worship team? I usually get songs to them at least a week in advance. I detail who is doing a solo. I do lyric sheets that detail when it's a solo, unison, parts. Each member already knows what part they sing. Sometimes I get the songs to them 10 to 14 days in advance. I have asked them to be prepared to rehearse on Sunday morning. I don't do practice during the week as I know they all have busy lives. However, I have a member that regularly admits he doesn't listen to the songs. He seems to regularly ignore my messages. I can't prove that, but there are hints that lead me to this assumption. As a side note, this member recently admitted to my face to trashing me behind my back. He apologized, but hints show that he's probably still doing that. Of course, I'm not happy about disunity, and I don't believe I'm expecting too much, am I? If I'm taking several hours out of my week to attempt to make their lives easier, is it too much to ask that they take advantage of that and be prepared? Most of them do, and I'm thankful, but one continues to give me problems. All right, I'm going to start by saying this. I feel like you started off with I'm being too hard on my worship team. And then the truth came out that it was really only one person. I don't know, maybe you didn't mean to write it that way, and that's not actually what's happening. But what I'm thinking in my head then is perhaps you think that this is a bigger problem than it actually is, because it started off big and it was like you kind of juked me. It was like my whole worship team is never prepared, and then it's like, well, there's this one guy who I'm having a problem with. So let me just say, I don't think that this problem is as big as maybe it feels in the moment. I'm not saying that it doesn't feel big in the moment, but just consider that maybe this problem isn't as big as you think it is, and the problem is actually just one person, but you're allowing that one person to affect how you view everything in your worship ministry. So just a warning for you not to do that if it is actually just one person. And so really the problem is, well, first of all, no, I don't know. Are you being too hard on your worship team? If you view this as a worship team-wide problem, but it's actually just one person, but then you bring it up at worship rehearsal and you're talking about it to everybody like it's a problem for everybody, then yeah, you're probably being too hard on your worship team at large. I don't think that's what you're actually asking, though. I believe you're asking, is it appropriate to expect someone on my worship team to prepare in advance, especially when I almost over-resource them way ahead of time, 2 weeks in advance? Should I expect them to show up to rehearsal prepared? And the answer is unequivocally yes. That is a perfectly fine expectation if you are doing everything that you say you're doing, giving them detailed information, giving it to them in advance. There is no reason that they should not be prepared when they show up to rehearsal. And so the question is, what do you do with the one guy? I will highlight that because that's ultimately where this led. Most of them do prepare, and I'm thankful, but one continues to give me problems. Then what do? You stop bringing it. Maybe you've been bringing it up just in ambiguous terms to your team, and you're like, guys, when we show up, we really need to be prepared to rehearse and not just run through the songs. And you bring that up at worship rehearsal in front of everybody, but you never actually confront the problem person. And so what you need to do is you need to have a private conversation with that person. And I know I said confront. I wouldn't view it as confrontation, although it might be kind of confrontational, but don't try to make it confrontational just for the sake of making it confrontational. But I mean, it sounds like you have some relationship with this person because you said he already admitted to trashing me behind my back. First of all, that's not appropriate, so that needs to stop. It's not even appropriate to trash a bad worship team leader behind their back, let alone a good worship team leader, which it sounds like you're resourcing your people well. So from that aspect, at least, it sounds like you're doing a good job leading your worship team. So you need to go to him and you need to say, hey, I noticed that you haven't been prepared. Like, it seems like when you show up, you don't know your parts, and we have to stop and start a lot. And I was just wondering, is there anything more that I can give you? And that way you kind of put the onus on yourself and you're seeking to understand them, hey, is there anything more that I can give you to help you be prepared whenever you show up to rehearsal? Now, you know in your head, you give them plenty of stuff, but maybe he's like, no, I have everything I need. And then I'll be like, okay, well, then I need you to be prepared whenever you show up to rehearsal. If you have everything you need, why aren't you prepared? And I wouldn't say it like that, but that's kind of where the conversation would lead for me. I'd be like, okay, first of all, I'm seeking to understand, is there something that you're missing? Is there some reason that you're unable to be prepared when you show up? Okay, there's not. Then why aren't you prepared? I mean, you're getting the song lists, you're getting all the resources. Is there, some reason that it doesn't seem like you're prepared? I'm just trying to understand the situation here. And I would probably come at it from that angle. Now, here's the thing. You can't just be understanding forever. You've got to, at some point, it's probably appropriate to say, well, if you're not prepared, then I can't continue to schedule you to serve on the worship team on Sundays, especially because we don't have rehearsals during the week, we rely on people to come ready on Sunday morning. And so that's why I send out songs 14 days in advance, 2 weeks in advance, with all of the necessary things that you need to learn. That's why I do it, because I'm expecting people to show up with their music learned. And so that's really important to function in the worship ministry at this church. And so I need you to do that. And so I wouldn't necessarily start with that attitude, but once you have laid the expectations down and communicated them well and said, this is what needs to happen if you're going to serve on the worship team, then you need to hold people to those expectations. And the problem is that a lot of worship team leaders don't have those expectations for the worship team. So if that's you and you've never communicated any form of expectations to your worship team, check out down in the description below my worship team toolkit. I've got my worship team code of conduct in there. I call it my worship ministry overview, but it's essentially a code of conduct where I outline all of the expectations that I have for my worship team members. I give it to them up front when they join the worship team, but you can give your current worship team members this as well. And you can basically copy and paste my worship ministry overview right into your worship ministry. And then you have something to hold people to and say, this is what we are about as a worship team. Even this is what we've committed to as a worship team. And then you hold people to that and say, we talked about in our worship ministry overview, code of conduct, whatever you want to call it, handbook, these are the things that we need to do, and now I'm going to hold worship team members to that expectation. So check that out down in the description below if you need help with that. Who is responsible for the sound/tech issues when they arise? It seems like our worship director thinks it's the pastors, and the pastor thinks it's the worship director. We have a small team of guys who operate the sound desk, and there are always sound issues and personality conflicts between them, which is very frustrating. A few of us have tried to share our frustrations with them, but they don't seem to care. I would say that it just depends on the nature of your church. I've seen it go both ways, and it kind of depends on the size of your church. I think it also depends if the worship director is on staff at the church. People have different ways of structuring things in the church. Ideally, it makes sense for the worship director to be in charge of the tech team, just because they work so closely with them. And so if you're going to structure your church leadership in a logical way, I think it makes sense that the pastor is, at the top of the organizational structure. I'm not saying that in any weird way, like they lord over their pastorship or eldership over everybody else. I'm just saying they're at the top, and then the worship director serves underneath them, and then the worship director is probably in charge of the tech team, and they serve underneath them. And so in my mind, it makes the most sense for the worship director to be in charge of the tech team, but that's not always the case depending on the structure of your church. It sounds to me that it's more like your pastor and your worship director just need to have a conversation about, okay, who's in charge of these issues? It sounds like there isn't communication between those two. So for you, who is neither one of those, I don't know how much sway you can have in that situation. If you're just like, a member in the church, if you're just somebody on the worship team, I mean, I guess you can bring it up to the worship director. You could bring it up to the pastor and say, hey, I've noticed some problems with the tech team. It seems like there's always sound issues. Is that something you deal with, or is that something the worship director deals with? And maybe that just jogs their brain to be like, somebody needs to deal with this. Is it me or is it the worship director? But as far as you making a decision about this, I would just say, hey, there's been sound issues. Seems like there's conflict back at the tech booth. I just wanted to point it out to you. Now, if you serve in the tech team, which I couldn't tell if you serve back there or not, or if you're just observing it. But if you're in the tech team, then I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, hey, we've been having some conflict back here. And you go to the worship director and say, we kind of need some help back here because there have been sound issues, there have been personality conflicts, and we need somebody to kind of lead us through that. And if the worship director says, well, that's not my job, go talk to the pastor, and you go to the pastor and they say, well, that's not my job, go talk to the worship director, then I would say to the pastor, because they are more in charge than the worship director. It's funny you say that because I talked to the worship director and they said go to the pastor. So honestly, I'm not sure who to talk to. And then you kind of force the hand of the pastor, so to speak, to be like, okay, this person doesn't know who to talk to, and he can tell that we're just kind of pawning the responsibility off on one another, so we probably need to come to a conclusion about who's actually in charge. And I think that expectations can work not just for worship teams, but also for tech teams as well, and you can probably apply some of the expectations in that worship team toolkit I talked about earlier to your tech team, and then that will help solve some of the conflict on your tech team. So once again, I'll link the worship team toolkit. You could also adapt it for your tech team as well. I'll link that down in the description below. Other than that, until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.